Being hyper-aggressive in heavy tanks can get you to the front line as quickly as possible, but it can also get you sent back to the garage very quickly. And today we're going to see how you can throw that ideology straight in the bin by looking at the Chinese heavy tanks. And why not start with one of the most overpowered Chinese heavy tanks that has turret armor better than a Mao's in the BZ-176, and we'll take a look at some of the others in the tech tree line in just a second. So how can this Chinese heavy tank that has rocket boosters be able to get into hyper aggressive positions at the start of the game to be able to come away with results that you would absolutely love in all of your vehicles and be able to pick up 2 kills within the first 3 vehicles that have been taken out within the game? Well, of course that's by taking the early position in highway, and this position right here is actually a fairly safe one, avoiding you from realistically getting hit by anyone because of the building to the left. Now, knowing that the T50-2 is going to get YOLO'd, he of course pre-aims the enemy VK2801-105 and finishes him off to be able to remove a lot of the vision from the enemy team, which is something you'll want to do really early on in the game if possible, so that you don't then get spotted in an aggressive position and so you don't get caught out by the light tanks who might try and flank you during the game. And of course, from a position like this, you can then just move forward and you can annihilate some of the lower tier vehicles you might come up against if you, of course, you are in a top tier game, as you're seeing here. Now, when being hyper aggressive, you don't want to make yourself the only target for opponents to hit, and of course you don't want to be in a position where only one or maybe none of your team are going to be able to hit the people if they do decide to YOLO you, and this position here on highway allows you to do that, since they will have to be able to kind of YOLO into you to get a free shot of damage or potentially get any damage onto you, and therefore your teammates like the KV-1S or the Tiger 1 may be able to get some side shots into them, making it not worth it at all for them to be able to get shots into you. So in a game when your team are so low on hit points, of course when you are on the front line you want to be cleaning up the flank as quickly as possible, and that is exactly what this BZ is doing, removing the last remaining hit points on the flank, using that of course overpowered main gun that this tank has to be able to remove the majority of the remaining tanks. And of course, when you want to do a quick cleanup operation, you can use the boost to be able to come out, make it a nightmare for the opponents. And of course, you saw there, instead of coming round the corner and potentially getting penned by the KV-2, he instead gives him the upper angled plate to be able to avoid taking a bigger HE damage round from the KV-2, and of course limit how much damage he's going to take, and that way he can come around that corner after he's fired and finish him off, to then turn around and use the rocket boosters that he stored up at the beginning of the game, having not used them to get into the town area, so that he can then get back to the cup circle and provide cover on the cap. Now, knowing that the enemy team have pushed in towards the cap circle, you can always take one of the best positions to defend it, which is of course by the railway track, and that way you can use this to use the gun depression of these Chinese heavy tanks to remove a lot of the opponents as they cross or try and push towards the cap, avoiding them from being able to reach where the Lance and C is and get down into the dip, because once they reach there it is very difficult to get them out, and it causes a crossfire between you and where this UDES was last spotted and where the Lance and C would be if there was an opponent there. So instead of trundling his way towards the AT7 and the campers in the enemy's base, it's really imperative that you take your aggressive side out on the people that are going to be going for the cap, since you never want to lose to cap. And of course, when there are some top tier vehicles left on the enemy team still left alive and they are on this side of the map, you want to be the one facing them, since your team are not going to be able to cope with them for the majority of the game, especially if they are, for example, a Tiger 1 up against a T-34-3 or a Panzer 4S or any of the tanks, and they all come at once. So the key thing is just maintaining cover on this cap circle like you're seeing here, and dealing with some of these lower tier vehicles, removing them from the game using that one shot capability that this tank has. Whether that's good or bad in terms of balance, I don't know. But of course, now deciding that it is time to push towards this T-34-3 and the remaining tanks that seem to be pushing into the cap. into the town. And you can see here the T-34-3 pushes up to this ridge, and this is where using this ridge line here is quite defensible, since they have to push in this central area here to be able to get a free shot of damage on you. And since they aren't actually doing that right now, and they've decided that they're going to YOLO in like this Udez, who's obviously made a big mistake not realizing the alpha damage, you can quickly finish him off and then deal with some of the other vehicles like this T-34 and then remove them from the game when you're fully reloaded, making sure to angle your armor as quickly as possible towards them and give the best opportunity to bounce. And of course it's not that difficult when you are using a tank like this that pretty much has tier 9/tier 10 armor for a tier 8. So at this point in the game, you'll notice that the AT-7 has obviously pushed towards the town area, and when you are on such low hit points and potentially could get caught out in the side by such a tank that has very good DPM if it can continuously fire, you want to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to too many vehicles. And with an AT-7 and a T-34-85 still remaining, there is potential to be taken out, and when there's only 2 of you left, it could potentially be curtains. But unfortunately not able to connect the shell on the AT-7, going for a speculative shot as he's pulling back behind the ridgeline, not particularly too bad. But it's a nice play here to be able to block between him and the Lance & C, who is an easy pen for the AT-7, allowing him to cover his teammate and hopefully take out the AT-7 without his team taking any more damage than they already have. And a lovely shell into the cupola, which is what you want to do. And at this point the AT-7 decides to turn for the Lance & C, but too late, and the Lance & C finishes him off. A really good start and a really good end to this battle with only just the T-34-85 remaining. And this is the sort of plays you can make if you preserve those boosters in these Chinese heavy tanks, and that allows you to then mobilize yourself around the map to be up close and personal with as many opponents, which is what this high alpha damage gameplay is often what you want, with the increased accuracy that you will get from being closer to your opponents, since you don't have as big of a dispersion over the distances that you may have to face opponents if you were to push them and they're sat in a hill in a bush somewhere. So having the opponents right up close to you allows you to pinpoint those weak points a lot easier than, like you say, when they're further away. Now with just the T-34-85 on the enemy team left, him and the Lance & C on his team decide to push towards the cap. It's a very easy win when you're both tier 8 tanks up against a tier 6 vehicle, and he quickly removes him for the 9th kill of the game and the 11th kill between his platoon. So a fantastic round of World of Tanks. So we've seen what the premium version of the Chinese heavy tanks can do, but obviously does this translate to the tech tree vehicles? And that's exactly what we're going to witness in this portion of the video. We have of course the tier 9 and the tier 10 to look at, so you guys are fully informed for when you see these on the battlefield, and making sure that if you are deciding to play them, you end up playing them correctly, since aggression is often one of the best ways to increase your damage and perform well, and make sure that you are having the impact that you need to perform and come away with a bigger win rate than you have currently. And that is ultimately what all of these videos are for. So if you want to aggressively hit that subscribe button, that would be a massive help to the channel. And so what we're seeing here is of course the early push on Paris, and this is a simple push that gets you up close and personal. You can use the hold down tactics that these Chinese heavy tanks have, so that you can then trade with a lot of the American tanks and some of the other vehicles that and this allows you to trade with a lot of the heavy tanks that don't particularly have the best turret armors, things like American heavies, and also looking at some of the British tanks like the Conqueror and the Super Conqueror. And when you get into a position like this, you can cover all your teammates who might be pushing, and although at the beginning of the game you see the aggression, you can hold back and you can preserve your boosters so that you're not wasting them at the beginning like you see with a lot of tanks, so that then when you need them in the later game you can use that aggressive tactics. Because although aggressive gameplay doesn't always necessarily work, when you save and make sure that you are aggressive when you need to be, that is the perfect matchup of what you need to do, and that is exactly what we're going to see in this replay. Now unfortunately not able to hit the T-57 heavy. Hitting that in the side of the turret would have finished him off, or at least taken away the last remaining few hit points of his vehicle, so that his enemy friendly team would have been able to finish him off. But it doesn't matter anyway, because his friendly BZ finishes him. And at this point in the game it's time to now push this flank, since like in the previous game on Highway, you've seen that the majority of the enemy tanks are on the other side of the map. So if you can manage to find some easy shells and be able to trade with some of the heavies on this side, finish them up as quickly as possible, you're going to be able to then turn around and deal with the other tanks that are going to be pushing either your cap circle or be able to flank whilst they're getting stuck against the forces that you have in the field area on Paris. Now this is some textbook flanking on this area of the map, and this is a typical example of what happens when you win the underpass section and you can pull up and you can be able to deal with some of the tanks that are of course caught out on the top area, where they have to either angle towards the teammates on the bridge or be able to angle towards you, and they can't do both, which means they're going to at least take a few shells, and that is exactly what you're seeing here. And luckily the mouse is actually angling towards the other teammates, and that allows him to farm up some easy damage, and that way he's going to be able to help remove the mouse as quickly as possible, and once that's done you can then move and to deal with the rest of the vehicles like the Progetto that's just hit him in the side. Now unfortunately the mouse is now pushed behind the hill, exactly the play you'd want to do if you were the mouse, limit how many shells can take into you, and I'm not surprised that that's exactly what he did. It's a good play. Unfortunately for the mouse, there's only so much he can do, and the BZ-75 on his team manages to finish him off. Now when you do take aggressive positions like this, it's always imperative that you do a side scrape, because of course when you come out with the frontal hull armor exposed, you can quite easily take a ton of damage, and that is not what you want, especially when you're fighting things like the Waffle Panzer IV, who do have quite high alpha and can remove quite a decent chunk of your hit points with each shell, and of course they're going to primarily out reload you too. But at this point in the game the team are starting to really mop up damage, so at this point he's not needing to preserve his hit points. Yes, you could have side scraped against the Waffle, but you could have opened yourself up to the Progetto, who could have peeked you, and the Gorilla 15, so it's not necessarily the worst thing to do, but yeah, maybe you could have optimized that a little bit better in this replay. But either way, yeah, it's now time to push towards the last remaining vehicles. Having saved up the 3 boosters, it allows you to have a little bit more flexibility when you want to move in the BZ and of course the Chinese heavies, since you can then push forward and get some free shots into tanks using flanking maneuvers, and that way you can avoid taking any of the hits that you might do because of the slowness that you'd have when you haven't got the boosters active. Of course, having these boosters makes the tanks just that little bit more special, and why they are quite good at being this aggressive tank in the late game. Now luckily the Grill 15 does manage to bounce off of him, and this is a brilliant position to be able to use the boosters, because what do you want to do? Well, if you are covering open ground and you're in a tank like this that does require you to at least get a hold down to be able to reliably bounce because of the turret armor being much stronger than of course the lower plate, then using the boosters allows you to get away from being in that open field and then deal with the tanks that are in this sort of area like the Scharffuture, and it avoids you then taking shells on the left from things like the Gorilla, and just limits how many tanks are able to shoot you all in one place. Now unfortunately the Gorilla 15 does take an aggressive push, which isn't the worst thing he could have done, but of course the Gorilla didn't know whether there was any more teammates over this side, and so yeah, it can be a little bit painful to be able to deal with these. But a nice little shell into the lower plate of the Gorilla finishes him off, and unfortunately the BZ does miss on his team, but the ST1 actually manages to finish him off either way. But at this point you are now a one shot, so it is careful kind of aggression now. You can't be full force with this tank, and of course running out of the boosters limits how fast you can push through certain areas, so you have to be a little bit more careful when playing these sorts of tanks without those boosters. But what is nice is trying to find a shell into the Scharffuture. Of course, a pretty paper tank and a lovely shell connects to the turret, picking up over 8,000 damage in this game and nearly 9,000, so just a few more hits could potentially push that damage over 9,000 and even potentially 10,000. You just kind of have to find that damage left in the game, and with only 1,700 left, you've got to be the furthest one forward to be able to remove them, or potentially try and get some assistance damage by tracking the opponents in the late game for easy mopping up of the damage. And luckily the 704, in terms of getting more damage, does actually manage to take out his teammate. Not the best if you're trying to win the game, But at least he's able to find out where the 704 is and find out that he is no longer going to be able to take some shells from his teammates, which means he can take up all of that damage if he can play it right. And unfortunately for the 704, he doesn't actually manage to maintain a peak on the hill, and that way he can pull around with basically no possibility of taking any more damage. And with just a Char Futura on the enemy team left on a little bit of hit points that could take him over the 10k damage mark, he goes for the shell and of course does manage to do it, picking up over 10,151 damage and showcasing why these Chinese heavy tanks can be very, very powerful and why you'd probably want to try them. But make sure you see what the next replay has in store, because this is the big boy tier 10. And the tier 10 does have 5 boosts that you can use on this vehicle to allow you to get into position early, and you can use multiple of them getting into the early game position, like you're seeing here up against the Centurion Action X. And unfortunately he does track him, and this is a dangerous spot to be tracked in, since there are the TDs that can hit you from the bushes and be able to remove a lot of your hit points. But unfortunately for the Action X, he is singled out on his own up against the BZ75, and with the alpha that this tank does get on its AP rounds of 650, he can outtrade him quite easily, but you do have to be a little bit careful, and you can always use the boost to get that extra little bit of damage if you are feeling like you need a bit of RAM in your life. And that is exactly what happens to the Action X, and he did not expect that one for sure. Although he does take quite a few shells and has lost the half of his hit points at this point, he's now got the central area to be able to deal his own gameplay style onto, and that is exactly what we'll see. Once again, using the boost to be able to get across into the center on Abby is one of the key things that you can do, so that you can avoid taking any shells from the snipers in the back as you quickly move past their screen, and often people aren't going to be able to react in time to be able to get you, especially if you are undetected when you are making that crossing play. And unfortunately, once again, like we saw in the previous replays, you're seeing that the enemy team have pushed super aggressively on the western side of the map by where his friendly AMX M4 is and the Rinoceronte. But having got into the position that he's in right now, he's going to maintain this hill area and the castle to be able to then deal damage to the aggressing tanks like the AMX M4 and the enemy team, the FE4005 and the 140. If you're sure that the enemy tanks aren't going to come up from behind you, you can use this position quite effectively to be able to remain undetected as you fire, and even if you do get detected, you can use the wreck of the kind of fake destroyed tank. Is not actually a real tank, but of course just the wreck that is in front of him to be able to hide some of that lower plate, and you can get hold down here so that they aren't going to be able to deal a ton of damage. And you can also support any teammates that are on the hill, as you're seeing here, to remove any of the YOLO wagons that might focus people like your teammate in the AMX M4. And unfortunately he does get taken out, but at this point he's just able to mop up a ton of damage on the aggressors to the point where it's not worth it for them to actually push. And often that is the mistake that a lot of teams make, is they push way too early before they've removed a lot of people in the center, and that is going to cost them dearly throughout this game. So we talked about when the enemy tanks can push into the center, this position becomes a lot less effective since you're going to be perma spotted, and they can also get over to where the light tank is to proxy you and come even closer to be able to reliably proxy you, and that can be a real problem, especially when you're coming up against tanks like the FE4005 who do not need to actually pen you to deal damage, and often will be able to do just as much damage as you deal to them, even if they don't manage to pen if they're using the Hesh round. So just be careful if you do find yourself coming into this position and you're seeing the light tanks or mediums or whatever in the position that you're seeing the Panzerwagen was just in. Now this game is going from bad to worse, as the enemy tanks are now pushing towards the base, and they've also got 4 extra vehicles. Even though the hit points are actually pretty similar, the extra tanks are able to dish out a lot more damage in one round or a couple of rounds than you're able to deal when you're one-on-one with a vehicle, and that is unfortunately the advantage that the enemy team have. But having known that, because they had pretty much the same hit points, a lot of the enemy vehicles are lower on hit points, which allows you, in a tank that has slightly higher alpha than a lot of the mediums and some of the heavy tanks, to be able to farm up those last remaining tanks and remove them from the game so they no longer become a problem. The only thing that you do have to worry about when you are in this spot right here, which is a defendable position against tanks like the AMX M4s that are pushing, is the FE 4005 potentially coming up from behind you and getting a free shot from the base into the back of you, which is not what you want at all. But luckily for him, the FE 4005 didn't want to do this and is subsequently removed from the game, removing one of the most dangerous tanks to the BZ-75 in this position. And doing the next play he's about to do is going to drop down off of the hill to get into a better spot to deal with these AMX M4s and also surprise them and get a free shell of damage into the side of them potentially, or remove them from the game. And there you go, an easy way of getting around your opponents and not only just sitting back and waiting for the opponents to make the aggressive play, but you as the tank that is in the kind of disadvantage to be able to also do this. Now unfortunately, one of the worst things that could possibly happen is getting set on fire by the enemy 60 TP, not only taking a huge shell from 60 TP's gun, but yeah, taking that extra fire damage, which was not ideal whatsoever. But either way, it doesn't tick for a ton of damage, but not what you want when you are trying to carry the game at this late stage. Now he does ping to his teammates to try and actually help him. The Centurion Action X does not look like he wants to bother coming around and trying to poke where the 60 TP is and spot him, which is really disappointing, and it's stalling his game from being anything else than it already is. But luckily the 60 TP does use the initiative and come towards the last remaining vehicles in the game and help him out, which is really nice, and of course allows him to get a free shot into the side of the MX's turret, and that way you can now do the plays that you're hoping to. Unfortunately the 60 TP then subsequently takes out the 60 TP, bit of a weird one there, but either way, he now removes him from the game, and that allows him to get into a better spot, and he can hopefully carry from this spot to then get a free shell into the 113. He gets taken out, but now it just leaves him up against that 60 TP, who is unfortunately on nearly full health, with both the team members remaining on his side on low hit points too, to the point where they're all one shots, and especially when you have that raging artillery in the background that could potentially end your career as well. So he does decide at this point in the game to actually make the play to going forward, and for some reason the Backtrack 58 has actually decided that he has pushed really far into the friendly base, which I guess could be a good position given the fact that a lot of the enemy tanks actually push this side. But of course staying here at this late game was not a good play, and I have no idea what he was still doing there. But either way, 60 TP is the target of the next few moments. Now unfortunately the 60 TP did actually remove both the Carnarvon and the FE 4005, as the 4005 tried to cap and the 60 TP managed to push down from this position right here into the centre and able to then finish them both up, which is the power of the centre on Abbey, and it is super critical of a position. But you can use the bushes here to take advantage like the 60 TP did against the BZ-75, and hopefully he's going to be able to do the exact same thing to the 60 TP, even with such a horrible disparity between the two hit points of the tier 10 heavies. Now the 60 TP decides to get into the friendly cap, which is potentially a good idea, but in doing that he alerts the BZ into knowing exactly where he is, and now he can formulate a plan. And because the 60 TP is most likely going to be sat behind this rock right here to avoid taking any shells, or maybe he's going to be in a slightly different position, there is still a very slim shot, and he loads a heat round, and the 60 TP now looking like he's going to offer up that little bit of turret. There is a potential shot in there, but it is a very slim one, and so you have to be a little bit careful. Now you could load a HE round to just reset the cap if you can get lucky, but at the end of the day it's not going to deal any damage, and at this point in the game you've just got to go for it, and that's exactly what he does, going for that aggressive push once again, fighting and trying to find the last remaining vehicle and then hopefully be able to surprise him, come from a different direction. But the one problem that you do have in this vehicle is that he has run out of boost, so if it comes down to it and the 60 TP just goes and tries to YOLO, he has to reload 3 times to remove him from the game and come out with a win, which is of course a very difficult mission when the 60 TP has already been able to pick up a couple of his teammates and obviously appears to be be a decent player, but he does decide to flick onto the BZ, which was a bit of a misplay there, and that allows him to get a free shell into the lower plate of the 60 TP, removing him. But the 60 TP does exactly what you'd expect if you were in that position, and unfortunately for the BZ, he is coming straight at him. But fortunately, in a complete disarray, the 60 TP ends up firing HE, which of course doesn't even finish off this vehicle, and now the 60 TP has a pretty long reload, and he seems to have 2 marks, but he doesn't manage to connect any shells, and he ends up throwing away all of those hit points against the BZ and allows him to win the game. And yeah, I mean, aggressive from the start, taking out multiple tanks and coming away with a victory is exactly what you want in these Chinese heavy tanks, and hopefully you enjoyed. So make sure that you do subscribe if you aren't already, and you look at some of these videos on screen right now. Make sure to like the video if you did, and join me back in the next one coming soon. Goodbye.